So to follow up this McKinsey report on net zero opportunities for India, decarbonizing India, let's look at India's plans and commitments under COP27, which is an extension of the efforts that have been going on, which started, of course, with the revised nationally determined contributions, updated contributions that were submitted in August 2022. So it remains committed to the global agreement, Paris Agreement, while also worrying about its economic growth, but take a long-term strategy on low-emission development. Comes with its own caveats about what the rest of the world needs to do for India to stay on track. So we'll look at some of those coming from the government. So updated NDCs, India stands further committed to first, reduce the emissions intensity of its GDP to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, which is an upgradation from, I think, 30%. Second, achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy sources by 2030. Again, an upgradation from the previous numbers. Third is to put forward and further propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living based on traditions and values of conservation and moderation, including through a mass movement for what the Prime Minister's office called lifestyle for environment, as a key to combating climate change. As articulated by Honorable Prime Minister, this is a call for a shift from mindless and destructive consumption to mindful and deliberate utilization. Okay. Implementations obviously are going to be important after these strategies are developed and commitments are made. So here is the speech of the Minister of the Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MOEFCC, at the launch of India's long-term low-emission development strategies presented to the COP27. Earlier, India submitted its intended nationally determined contributions to UNFCCC on October 2, 2015. The 2015 NDC comprised 8 goals. 3 of these have quantitative targets up to 2030, namely cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil sources to reach 40%, which is now updated to 50% as we saw. Reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% compared to 2005, which is upgraded to 40%. And creation of additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through additional forests and tree cover. So this is not explicitly there in the updated NDCs, but India is already one of the countries which has shown greening from 2002 to 2017. China and India topped that list. Of course, in India, the greening came a lot from agriculture as well. So the additional carbon sequestration associated with that greening has to be looked at. To read some more of the text from the minister's speech, as per the updated NDC, India now stands committed to reduce emissions intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030, not 40, from 2005 level, and achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fueled energy resources by 2030. Today's approval also takes forward the Honorable Prime Minister's vision of sustainable life cycle and climate justice to protect the poor and vulnerable from adverse impacts of climate change. So this is the government approving the updated NDCs and approving the long-term strategy for low-emission development strategies. The updated NDC reads, to put forward and further propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living based on traditions and values of conservation and moderation, including through a mass movement for lifestyle for environment, which we already read, as a key to combating climate change. The decision on enhanced NDCs demonstrates India's commitment at the highest level for decoupling of economic growth from greenhouse gases. So India wants to stay on its 6 to 10% economic growth goals, but without going deeper and deeper into enhanced greenhouse gas emissions. There are details about where the energy will come from and how much of the renewable energies are going to result in actual bending of the curve in terms of the emissions, and whether those remain consistent with the 1.5 or 2 degrees C warming targets, and so on and so forth. But here are the main points of the long-term strategy for low emission development. To put forward and further propagate a healthy and sustainable way of living based on traditions and values of conservation and moderation, including through a mass movement for lifestyle for environment as a key to combating climate change. This is updated. I'm reading these again and again just to re-emphasize that the government puts this out in multiple pieces. To adopt a climate-friendly and cleaner path than the one followed hitherto by others at corresponding level of economic development. So here is the placeholder saying don't just put pressure on us as to how we are developing and how our emissions are growing and emission intensity of GDP is changing, but keep in mind that other players got there with much higher levels of emissions before us. To reduce emissions intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030 from 2005 levels, which is updated from 30 to 35%, to achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel based energy sources by 2030 with the help of transfer of technology and low-cost international finance, including from the Green Climate Fund, which is updated. So here again is a stake to say this will not happen unless there is technology transfer and low-cost international finance available. So there are conditional NDCs and unconditional NDCs, things that will happen without international financial assistance and technology transfer versus those that will require technology transfer and low-cost international finance. To create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030, which remains the same as October 2015 commitment. So further caveats put in by the Indian government in the MOEFCC for minister's speech is, in setting our targets for 2030 and our enhanced ambition in mitigation, we cannot forget that achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, whose target date is also 2030, is the overriding priority for developing countries. So the climate adaptation mitigation goals must be synergistic and consistent with SDGs, which includes everybody else. Ending hunger and malnutrition and ensuring food security globally must be an essential part of our perspective for climate action. Mitigation alone, one SDG among all others, cannot be singled out for consideration. So how pressure is put on a country like India has to be considered in the context of all SDGs and not just one. We cannot have a situation where the energy security for developing countries is ignored in the name of urgent mitigation, while developed nations put their energy security above their duty to increase their ambition to mitigation through practical action. So if you look at oil and gas being sold by the US and Norway to Europe, and Europe burning more coal even because of the Russian war and the lack of or disruption to the gas supply, then you realize that we are all in this together and everybody is going to jump on using fossil fuels when it comes to continuing life as usual. Alright, so this is something that has to be kept in mind when it comes to energy security of developing countries like India as well. And of course there is the climate action tracker, which is tracking continuously how countries are doing in their overall rating in terms of climate action and climate commitments to the various goals of 1.5 degrees C, with fair share considerations where developing countries which have not historically contributed to cumulative emissions are given room to maintain their trajectories differently from the rich ones which have contributed, and also 1.5 degree C model domestic pathways. I won't go into the details, but obviously looks at emissions excluding land use change, forcing in million tons CO2 equivalent per year or going to 2030, and you have land use and forests in there as well. So there is the historical trajectory overall, and here we are with the dip for COVID, and then we are headed into these various projections and expected to exceed 2021 emissions in 2022 and so on. So there are internationally supported targets where we are critically insufficient for the 4 degree C plus world. Then policies and action will bring us to the edge of being less than critically insufficient. Fair share 1.5 degree C will bring us here in terms of emissions as well, and model domestic pathways. But based on fair share, these numbers change a little bit, so we go into policy and action and fair share targets being insufficient for a less than 3 degree C world as opposed to the 4 degree C world, and fair share targets here, policies and action bringing us here. So you can track these things in various ways, and these criticisms are fair in terms of just tracking emissions, but they ignore the other factors like how countries like India can manage their energy securities, whether they can really keep their coal in the ground, for example, considering right now majority of the power in India still comes from coal. So by 2030, upping the renewables to 50% is going to be making it easier to burn less coal, but coal is still going to be a major player for India well into 2030s and 2040, for example. So keeping an eye on the 2070 net zero goal for India, these long-term low emission development strategies are critical, but along the way technology transfers, finance, climate finance, and loss and damage and other tools, and climate equity just in terms of action by everybody are going to be critical as well. Okay, so I just wanted to include it here following the McKinsey report, since McKinsey report offers many strategies and accelerated scenarios, line of sight scenarios and so on, but these are the practical issues seen by the Indian government in its pathway to net zero by 2070 and decarbonization along the way. Okay.